Folks, hi. I'm Craig Newmark, lacking my own identity, just being the Craigslist guy. The folks here don't need any introduction. Arianna and the humans of Axios. I've learned a lot from everyone here, starting with, well, the only thing I remember from high school Shakespeare is brevity's the soul of wit, which is Shakespeare's way, I guess, of expressing his impatience when people found it difficult to get to the point, which is a very simple, oversimplified understanding of the point. But I've been impatient in meetings for some decades, wanting to find a way to be able to articulate why this might be a problem. It's important because something I've learned from Arianna is the need to balance all these things in one's life, to deal with the stressors of one's daily life. And I've read the book, Smart Brevity. It is the real thing. It offers really good advice on how to achieve that and what it's all about. And I really appreciate that in all sorts of ways. First, I can help people understand my need to relax a little bit. And then if I go so far as being a little bit rude, I am a nerd after all. And if I overemphasize the smart brevity thing, say by putting a giant poster of it in my Zoom room, which is a hint, by the way, giant poster of smart brevity for Zoom rooms, I'd appreciate that. But so I have literally started to cite it as of last week reading the book. And in a pinch like that, I just blame these guys and Arianna. Because, like the Batman says, I'm not the nerd you want, but I'm the nerd you got. So I'd like to welcome Arianna and the Axios guys.
Thank you so much, Craig. Craig and I were reminiscing that we've known each other ever since the early 2000s, before some of you were born. And for some reason, he doesn't change at all. So, Craig, thank you for being here, and thank you for all you're doing for democracy and civic life. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here with Roy Schwartz, Jim VandeHei, and Mike Allen, the authors of Smart Brevity, the creators of Politico and Axios. And as you guys know, I'm a huge fangirl. I start my day with Mike's newsletter. If any of you have not subscribed, please do so immediately, though not right now. We don't want you on your phones. And yesterday, I was telling them that the newsletter was late. And I just felt there was something wrong with the universe. It was as though the sun hadn't come up. And I kept literally asking everybody who is here that I work with, Danielle, did you get the newsletter? Miko, did you get the newsletter? I felt, was I personally excluded by Mike? And I'm also a huge fan of Smart Brevity. I have to tell you, I've read and underlined it, and I have also listened to it on Audible. And every time you get something new, some new nugget, you learn something new. And you would have thought this book is for journalists, but it's not, even though it definitely dominates the way you run Axios. But tell us why it's not just for journalists, why it's for everybody.
Mikey? Thank you very much. And thank you, Arianna. And quick thank you to Craig for being an authentic pioneer and for making this possible. So exciting to see my Axios colleagues here. Thank them. There would be no Axios and there would be no Smart Brevity book without all of you. So thank you. Quick story before I promise I'll answer your question. But a quick story about Arianna, who is one of the most well-known entrepreneurs alive and is extremely generous to people coming behind. So like over many years, Arianna's been extremely generous to all of us. And when Axios was brand new, very few people knew about it. They didn't know that it meant worthy in Greek. And when Axios was brand new, we were doing our first event. And we had a dream. And the dream was that Arianna Huffington would be on our stage. And she got on a train and came to DC just to do the first Axios event, then got on a train and went back. And it underscored my belief, little things matter, so thank you.
Thank you. I loved it.
So smart brevity is for everyone because there's not a single person in this room or in this audience around the world who doesn't want to be heard, to communicate more clearly, and all of that, of course, gives you more power. And our life, what we're living, is what the book Smart Brevity calls the fog of words, right? Like we're all engulfed in it, whether it's emails, whether it's our social feeds, whether it's Zoom rooms, like it's words all the time. Smart Brevity gives you the tools to cut through that. And whether you are a student, whether you are an intern, whether you're a day one employee, whether you are a boss, whether you want to be the boss, whether you are a mogul, Smart Brevity can help you whatever format you're talking in.
So in fact, smart brevity is the solution to the global problem of the fog of words. And you have some astounding statistics in the book that we spend only 26 seconds with each piece of content, that we check our phone 344 times a day or every 4 minutes. Indeed, our attention span right now is 8 seconds, which is 1 second less than that of the attention span of the goldfish. So tell us how that affects the quality of our communications.
It's atrocious, right? I mean, what's interesting is that you think about all the change in your own life, right? Like the number of distractions, the number of alerts, the number of dings and bells on your phone, the number of demands on your time. Like everything has changed. We're all perpetually more distracted, and yet nobody's taught anyone how to communicate differently in this moment, particularly in the workplace. And we saw it in journalism. Like one of the reasons that we created Smart Brevity is, to be honest, most journalists aren't very good writers. And most journalists like to indulge themselves by writing as many words as possible. So Smart Brevity's origin was to create handcuffs for reporters, to force them, tell us what's new and what's interesting. Tell me why it matters. Give me, the reader, the choice to go deeper. But once we launched the company, suddenly all these other companies, the NBA, JP Morgan Chase, United Health Group, started calling us saying, hey, our executives read you, but they won't read us. Will you teach us how to talk and how to communicate? And at first we're like, no, not our job. Go figure it out yourself. But eventually, like, there's something happening here. And it turns out that the problem for us as news consumers was even worse inside businesses, where you need people aligned, you need people knowing what matters, you need people paying attention to what it is you have to say, and yet you're still writing like it's 1990. And so I think no wonder Smart Brevity started to work as a solution for journalism, and then I think is now really started to work as a solution for businesses. And what I've found personally is that just the process of forcing yourself to write more sharply and think more succinctly, I think I'm a lot more articulate and smarter as a result of it. It sort of trains your brain to start to think in sharper terms. And that's ultimately what we want. If we invest time into something, to care enough about it, to pour ourselves into it, to learn about it, and then to share it, we just want people to remember it. So if you bury it in a vomit of words, it was wasted.
In fact, you mention in the book that Mark Twain in 1871 famously confessed to a friend, I didn't have time to write you a short letter, so I wrote you a long one. And then you also say that it was a Wall Street Journal reporter, David Rogers, who got the ball rolling, and you refer to him as the father of smart brevity.
He wouldn't, but I did. He was my mentor at the Wall Street Journal. I was a congressional reporter, and he was a very gruff, no-nonsense, not easy to get along with reporter who was my sidekick and many years my senior. And he took a piece that I wrote that he thought was a pile of shit, and he said, I'm going to show you how to do this. And it is write one line, tell me what is the most interesting thing it is that you have to say. Tell me why it matters, and give me your data points backing that thesis up top. And that structure ended up structuring how I started to write at the Wall Street Journal and afterwards. And at the very top of it, that is the core of smart brevity, which is, and the way it is like, so there's something about the species that like we're kind of interesting and we have evocative things to say until we get behind a typewriter or a keyboard or a phone. And suddenly we are the most unlikable people you're ever going to meet. We start using fancy words and weird acronyms. Like we don't talk like a human. And so if you can force yourself to talk like a human, and if I was at a bar or we're having coffee and I was going to tell you something interesting, I would tell you something that's new. I would give you the context for why it matters, and you would give me some kind of cue about whether or not you wanted to go deeper into that conversation. Well, that might tell you that that's how the brain wants to absorb information. So why wouldn't we start to apply that to the way that we're communicating? And it's not for everything. There's a lot of areas where you need depth. You need a long podcast, or The Godfather is always going to be 3 hours. But 95% of the communication that we do, particularly at work or particularly sort of day to day, should be much more succinct and much more respectful of the person you're speaking to or writing to.
So let's apply the smart brevity methodology to the midterms. They are less than 3 weeks away. So if we follow the smart brevity playbook, first of all, tell us something we don't know about the midterms. Then tell us why what you told us matters. And then tell us where we go to go deeper. Who wants to hear that?
Mike, that sounds like a challenge for you.
I know what you start. I'm
No,
gonna go
you're
second.
not going to let me start. You're going to go. Come on, do it. I believe in you, Mike. Yeah, let's chant.
So the core four that Arianna pointed to in the smart brevity.
Oh, Mike, they want you to lift your mic up.
Tell me something I don't know. What you don't know is that 28 days from now, November 8th, are the midterms. And I think everybody in this room is very excited to know. I think people assume the Republicans are going to get the House. You don't know by how much. The Senate's kind of teetering. You're excited to know. My Axios colleagues are excited to speculate about what it means. Here's what you don't know. You won't know. That night, maybe even the next day, maybe even the next day. It may be a while because in Georgia, the Senate race could be close enough that there's going to be a recount. So very unlikely we will know the Senate makeup that night. It may even be a couple weeks. And why it matters is that everything in Washington is pausing to depend on that. Like what we know is that we're going to have divided government. We know that we're going to have a Democrat in the White House. We know that we're going to have, we're pretty certain to have Republicans in the House. But which end of Pennsylvania Avenue is going to have more weight? And that will depend on the Senate. And on November 8th, you won't know.
That's
to go
fantastic.
deeper.
I love that. Bravo. Hi.
But wait, you forgot the most important part. Go deeper, Axios.com.
That's fantastic. And he had no advance notice of the question. So, in explaining smart brevity, Roy, you start off by saying in the book that it's about being short but not shallow. And I profoundly believe that we are kind of drowning in data and starved for wisdom. And I never have the feeling with Axios that we are being shallow. So what's the distinction? How can you be short but not shallow?
Yeah, I take a lot of this. So in the book, we talk about my dyslexia, my need for making everything as simple as possible. Especially did that when I was doing presentations for businesses. I just needed to figure out the most important points. I think doing that and doing that for news is kind of the same thing. You're trying to distill all of these different facts, all of these different things that are coming your way. But what are the one or two things that people are going to remember? Because unfortunately, we're not able to take that much in. And so the one or two things, that's what we've got to bring to the top, and that's what we've got to bring to the surface for people and make it easier for them, because we're all overwhelmed with so much information. The average person now gets 300 emails a day. That doesn't include the text messages, Slack messages, fake news, real news. And so we need to bring that stuff to the very top, make it easy to understand, and then explain the why it matters.
And here's the not shallow part. And a lot of people either miss the smart or the brevity part. And it goes to your Mark Twain point. I think it was Winston Churchill who said that a half-hour speech would be so much and a 15-minute speech would be twice as long, because you have to think it through. So what we tell our journalists is, before you type, think. And the magic is, at Axios, we're always audience first. And the magic of Smart Brevity is you do the work for the audience. Rather than making you plow through all the words, we figure out like what really matters. What do we want you to remember? As you know, Jim and I came up through newspapers, and we were literally paid by the yard, by volume of words, right? Because the longer the story, it's more likely to be on the Metro front or the front page. And if it's super duper duper long, it'll be on the Sunday front page. And if it's mega mongo long, it's going to be entered in a prize or even win a prize. But that was all about the publisher. It was who was trying to like fill space between ads. It was all about the journalists who wanted something on their wall. It wasn't about the audience. Smart Brevity says, I do the work on the front end. Boil it down, figure out what I really want to say, what really matters, and then here's the trade secret, here's the spoiler. Just say it. Put it up top. That's the secret.
In fact, we're talking backstage about how when we launched the Huffington Post in 2005, we put so much time and energy into what we called our splashes, the top story at the top, at the what would have been the front page story. And my absolute favorite was when Dominic Strauss-Kahn was arrested. And remember, he was the head of the IMF. And the splash, Smart Brevity, maybe we should call it Cheeky Brevity, OMG IMF. So what surprised me in the book is you said that these strategies have not only made you better communicators, better leaders, but that they made you better people. Now, I've known you for a long time, and I think you are great people. So how did the principles of Smart Brevity actually influence the way you lead your lives?
At the very core of it, it's what Mike was. At the very core of it's what Mike was talking about, which is the fundamental shift you have to make is stop writing for yourself, write for the other person, or speak for the other person. Most people don't do that. If you think about it, most communicating is rather self-indulgent. It's either us showing off or us wanting to make a point. Think about who you're trying to communicate to. The reason we started Axios in the very beginning, the origin of Smart Brevity, was we had done Politico, and at that point in time, we're like, what is the problem facing the news consumer and facing society? And from our point of view, it was that all of us in this room are going to need to know exponentially more about more topics at the very moment we're inundated with more information. That's a hell of a puzzle to solve. And so our solution was Smart Brevity, which is both parts. You need real intelligence, so you need reporters who had real expertise, but you needed the efficiency part. And so if I could be really efficient in explaining to you in a very economical way the latest thing that happened with Elon Musk or AI or robotics or media or politics, I'm now doing a service for you. And I think that's probably where I feel like it's made the biggest difference for us. It gives you much more of a true, like a servant mentality in terms of how are you communicating. The very first two words of our manifesto, which will never change, are audience first. Just think about that from the media perspective. You go back 5 years ago, no media company was actually audience first. If you went to the website, it was like going to a NASCAR race. The noise, the flashing, the smelly engines, the grossness. Like, it was awful. And we said, no, we're going to make it really pleasing on the eye. We're going to be really efficient with your time. We're going to be very respectful of your time. And once you start to do that, people can tell. This is a true story. When we did Politico, and I don't do this job to get thanked, but when we did Politico for a decade, I don't recall a single person ever writing or calling and saying, thank you for Politico. Matter of fact, they usually said the opposite. But we got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds in the first year of notes, letters, emails from readers saying, thank you. I can tell you're trying to save me time. You're respecting my intelligence. And that was the moment we knew we were onto something much bigger than we initially set out to solve.
And if I can just add to that, that's all about news and information. But when you apply that to work, the problem is even more extreme, right? It costs productivity, it costs money, regardless of whether you're at a not-for-profit or for-profit. It doesn't matter the type of organization. We're all drowning in really bad, poorly worded notes from internal or external people talking about themselves. And so I think part of like the smart brevity audience first mentality, if you start thinking about the other person, everything does become more efficient. And so that's, I think, what makes you a better person. Like imagine, I can just speak for Axios. All of our internal communication is done in smart brevity. It's way more efficient. And I think it respects the rest of the team. It respects everyone who's going to read your note, because you're thinking, does this really need to take 8 minutes of someone's time to read this note? No, I can do this in 3.
May I buzz in for 2 seconds? Roy is talking about being a better person. I'm the ruthless, cynical one up here. And smart brevity also gives you more power. So here's an example from the book, Smart Brevity. I talked to a teacher in Northern Virginia who would write long emails to his parents, and they clearly weren't reading them because they would reply and ask him something that was spelled out in the email. And what we see in smart brevity from the eye tracking studies, from the data of media publishers, is that anytime our eye encounters what Jim would call a glob of text, a block of text, we skip it, right? And so this teacher did something magical. They read Axios AM as part of a good breakfast, and they saw that we picked out like what were the important points, that we bolded them, that we highlighted them. This teacher tried that, and overnight, he stopped getting stupid emails from his parents. They focused on what he wanted them to. And here's the secret is that it wasn't the bolding, it wasn't the bullets. It was that he took time on the front to think about what was important, what he wanted people to do, what he wanted people to remember. He spelled it out, and they did it. So yes, it makes you a better person, but it also gives you more power.
Actually, I love the section in the book where you talk about smart brevity regarding email, and we've all been practicing it. Nobody now at Thrive starts an email saying things like, I hope you are well.
I saw there's an ugly Christmas sweater that says, hope you're doing well in these hard times.
It's like, it's how people who are trying to sell you something start their emails. And also to Roy's point about work, there's so much amazing stuff about meetings. The meetings are the bane of everybody's existence. So smart brevity will teach you, first of all, how a good meeting starts the day before. It's planned in a certain way. I'm sorry, I'm talking about the book like I wrote it. I did not write it. I just love it. So Roy, tell us about meetings.
Yes. So you talked about starting the day before. So, think about who's going to be there, who needs to be there, and more importantly, who doesn't need to be there. I think people over-invite to meetings, so let's start there. The second is have a well-thought-out agenda and send your thoughts ahead of time so that people have time to think about their answers, think about questions that they will have, think about why they're there. Then in the first few seconds of the meeting, talk about the agenda. Like, this is what we're going to cover, this is what we're going to try and get done today, and then make sure that you have a goal at the end. Like, what are you actually going to come out of this meeting doing what, deciding what, and make sure that you fulfill that. Because, again, audience first, they're spending their time, 7, 8, 9 people in a room, they better come out with some type of output. And so making sure that you're respecting that is really important. People, I don't think about the amount of time that is wasted in meetings. If you have 1 or 2 extra people in a meeting, you just wasted 2 hours of their day for nothing.
And that's why most people in meetings multitask. Like they're doing something else at the same time.
But the brain doesn't work that way. So when we went into this, we talked to a bunch of folks and did a bunch of research on the brain science. And we went into it, and I assumed what we would find is that because people are staring at their phone all day instead of paying attention to us, that it was rewiring your brain, that there'd be like some kind of chemical difference or some kind of mapping difference in the brain. There's actually not a lot of evidence that that's true. What is true is that we are terrible, and have been since the creation of our species, at multitasking. We're terrible multitaskers, which means, so when you're doing something, if you get distracted, it takes the average person something like 20 minutes to truly get out of that, refocus, and be in a position where they can now absorb information. So when you think about meetings, the most egregious waste of corporate time, of all of our time, is staring at PowerPoints. Our brains are actually not capable of looking at something visually and hearing something simultaneously in absorbing both. So you're actually, most PowerPoints are doing everything your brain would tell you not to do if you wanted people to pay attention to what you're doing. A PowerPoint should actually be very sparse, should just guide the conversation, shouldn't be distracting, shouldn't have all these exotic images that someone spent all this time putting together that you're sitting there, oh, is that like Michelangelo, or is that a chart? And like, now you're not paying attention. And that's what this is all about. It's that, how do you get people to pay attention to what matters? I can't run the company without it. The Smart Brevity, as much as it matters to the end consumer, and as much as it matters for the book, I don't know how I'd run the company without it, because it allows me every Sunday, if I didn't send a newsletter to my Axios colleagues saying, here are the 5 things in order that matter most, here's why we did them, and this is what's going to happen next. Well, think of the magic of that. Now when we meet on Monday, there's no looking back. I can take questions about what we've already done, and then we can move forward. And we have every single manager does that. And so that's when we wrote the book. Because like Mike and I have been covering politics forever. We could have written a bunch of books. We've never written a book because we didn't want to spend the time looking back. Never thought there was something we covered that was so cool. We wanted to dedicate a year to it. But because we saw the magical difference that this made in people's lives and in ours in running a company, we had to write it. And once we started working with companies that adopted Smart Brevity, and they would take things that were being opened by 20 or 30% of people in companies were suddenly being opened by 70 or 80. And the people who were writing it were becoming superstars when they might have been low-level communicators in the past. It just shows this hunger. But if you just stop and think, and this is what's so weird now about running businesses, I didn't do it until we started a couple of companies, is that like, no one ever just stops to think like, why do we do that? Right? So like think about an intranet. Like companies still have intranets where they put information. They expect us to like, oh, I've got a free hour. I think I'm gonna go dig through the internet, see if I can't find that healthcare policy. I'm gonna read it. Like no human being would do it. And if they did it, they shouldn't work for you because they have to be the most boring person imaginable. And yet they do it that way. So then you get a note from your boss. It might be 2, 3, 4, 5 pages. Like who would read that? Like one of the great tests we always tell journalists, like, would you read that if you didn't write it? It's like one of the great tests. Like, most of the time the answer is no, don't write it. Don't write it. And so just like thinking about that and how do you help people to convert to a different way of communicating? Because ultimately, if you're a better communicator at your job, I think society benefits from it. I think companies doing well, people doing better in their jobs, people feeling more productive in their jobs, we ultimately all benefit from it. But when we were writing the book, Stuart Butterfield, who's the CEO of Slack, was doing an event, and he had like an aha moment that I had not thought about. He said, I run a company. If you're a leader or a manager, you probably spend 80% of your time communicating up, down, to investors, to customers. If you're rank and file, you probably spend 50 to 60% of your time communicating, working on a project, talking to a colleague. And Yet, so if you think about it, the vast majority of your money in a company goes to communicating, and not a single person has ever pulled you aside and told you how to do it effectively or how to do it better. That's insane. Like if you're making widgets and you were making them in a terribly inefficient way or in a way that wasn't satisfying the customer, you would change it. And yet no one had done that with communications.
I love that because it also applies not just to words but to visuals. You call it elegant efficiency. And I love all your designs. And you even apply it to emojis. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a place for emojis, right? Like in terms of like what we do is just kind of walk. It's kind of a playful chapter, but the idea is you've got to be authentic, right? So like if there's an emoji, a wink, or something, a smile, like people want to be entertained, and like emojis you got to be careful with, because if if you're starting to overuse them, or if you're not actually that interesting to begin with, or you're not that funny, they're probably incompatible. But they're one of the cues that can say I'm a human. That's the other mistake, the big mistake that people make. There's the selfishness one, but the other one is just not writing authentically. When I communicate to you, there shouldn't be that. When you read the book, hopefully it sounds like my voice, right? Because I'm trying to communicate to you in writing the way I would communicate to you in person. And all of us should do that. Like, yes, maybe if you're like in a regulatory environment working for a bank and you got to worry about the SEC or something like that, you might need to use a little legalese. But most of us don't. We can communicate like normal people. People are dying for normality.
And you actually give a lot of advice, a lot of hand-holding in the book, a lot of examples of how we do it wrong and how we can do it better, that I absolutely love. And the distinction you make between strong words and weak words, words that grab you and words that don't. Can you please elucidate that? Incidentally, elucidate is a bad word. So I'm just using it deliberately.
That was cheeky brevity.
Have at it, Mike.
So when I was a brand new reporter, great writing coach Paula LaRock from the Dallas Morning News, she came and did an exercise with us, and she read a passage. It was about a fish, and she read a passage, and it was very vivid. And I was like, wow, this is a good writer. Like I really care about this fish, right? Like I can visualize this fish's journey. And she asked us, a bunch of cub reporters, this was back when I had hair, and she said, what was distinctive about that passage? And nobody got it. What it was that every word was one syllable. And so you used the word grab, punch, lock. If you think about it, like one syllable words are strong words. They're vivid. And so my friend Noah Bresner, who works with me on Axios AM, on our subject line, we will literally take in a 3-syllable word, we'll see if we can make it a 2-syllable word. A 2-syllable word, we'll see if we can make it a 1-syllable word, because it is almost always a stronger, more vivid word. The other day I ran across in copy, heretofore. And I was like, come on. Like, if we're in a bar, like, you're not going to say heretofore, right? And this is where the communicating as humans, and like one of the hacks that we have in our book, Smart Brevity, is reading a passage out loud. It works with the lead of a newsletter, it works with a memo, it works with an update within a company, it works with a letter. And the magic of reading out loud is that right away you realize if you're using one of those $10 words, as Grandma Powers would say, or the SAT words that Jim was talking about earlier. You'll realize heretofore, I'm not going to say that. And here's the biggest one. If you're reading it out loud and you bore yourself, you have 0% chance of reaching your audience.
Yeah.
And actually, all that applies very much to social media. And so much has been written about social media, but what you're writing about social media is truly the best. I hope nobody's going to leave here without buying a book, because we are barely scratching the surface.
And excuse me, and if you're watching around the world, smartbrevity.com.
Smartbrevity.com. And so you write that social media is the hand-to-hand combat of attention warfare. So how can we be better at it? How can we be better at grabbing attention? Or should we just opt out of social media, surrender, sue for peace? Like, what do you advise?
Yes, would be my first advice, but most of you aren't going to take it, right? Most people are on social media. But there, too, it's like applying these principles, like the grab me principle. Like, what is the most important thing you have to say? What is the shortest, most succinct, muscular way that you can say it? And then say it that way. Because if you're getting on social media, you obviously have something that you think is important to you. I don't think you should get there in the first place because it's often mind pollution and a waste of time. But people are going to continue to do it. So if you apply those principles, or if you're going to use visuals, like you mentioned visuals earlier, I think one of the most distinctive characteristics of Axios is not the written word; it's the visuals. We have these geniuses who have applied this idea of elegant efficiency to both like the design of our site, the design of our mobile interface, but also to the visuals that we use. And if you look at them, they're always super clean and super direct. They're never loud. And the idea is it's the exact same thing. Like if you want engagement, you see a lot of this on the studies, we see it on our site. If you want someone to pay attention to something, it's your headline, it's the first couple of words, or it's an arresting image. People do not understand the power of a great picture or the power of a wonderful visual. The opposite is true. Like if it just looks noisy, it's like your brain just tunes out. And that's where you look at these skimming and scanning studies. It is crazy, and it's everyone. I used to think it was, oh, no, not everyone. Like, most people love to read my 1,800 words of brilliance. And it turns out, like, nobody does. That was, like, if you want to go way, way back, that was the very origin of Mike and I becoming obsessed at that moment with this idea of efficiency. Was we were at Politico, and we had written a couple of columns together, and two of them that President Obama had to respond to. There's 1 million page views. Man, we thought we were so cool. Everyone was hanging on our every word. And that's back when you had to paginate pages. So you had to click 1, 2, 3, 4. And we looked at the data, and it was really the first time we'd ever looked to see how much are people actually reading. And it was really a humbling come to Jesus moment for us. 86% of people had dropped off after the first page of our columns. And these columns are like, they were deeply reported, and we thought you had to come for the entire journey. That means that only 14% of people read more than 486 words. So the next step was we picked up the phone, we called the folks at Facebook and New York Times. We're like, what's your data showing? How often are people actually going into your stories and reading more than the headline and the first graph? And it was universal. Almost nobody was. And this was right when newsletters were taking off, which made sense. Like I was wondering, why are CEOs or political leaders or people, no matter sort of their education level, were moving towards newsletters? Because people were hungry for information to be shorter and more efficient. And I think ultimately that's what became of smart brevity.
Why it matters? We thought, as we typed all these words, we thought, well, at least our mom is reading it. We discovered not even mom.
So, I've been thinking of all the areas of life where smart brevity would make things better. Like the State of the Union. The State of the Union is always so long and bloated. You never say, oh my God, I wish there was another 20 minutes. So what can we do to change that? And could you ever, as journalists, offer your services to create, even if it's just for us, even if nobody actually speaks it, to create for us a good, smart brevity State of the Union? What do you think? Wouldn't it actually be great? Maybe after the State of the Union Biden gives, you could take it and break it down into smart brevity for the next day's newsletter, Mike.
How about 2 words? Do better.
Do better. Build back better.
But it would, you're half joking, but it would work. It's another one where, we've always done it this way. So we do a laundry list of things that everyone dozes off listening to, and we know who's going to rise and who's going to fall in terms of their applause lines, and no one ever thinks, is there a more effective way to do this? One of the things we talk about in the book is Jamie Dimon writes this pretty famous annual letter about his sort of thoughts on the state of the world. It's 60,000 words. And so his staff kind of secretly said, hey, they hired our business side, said, can you turn this into something that people would read, 1,000 words? And the engagement on that was exponentially higher than on 60,000 words. But if you think about that 60,000 words, it's no different. There's entire industries that are built on just producing things no one will ever read. Think tanks, right? All these big reports that really smart people pour all of this energy and time into, and no one ever bothers to think, anyone read that? Should anyone read that? Would anyone read that? Whereas I bet you inside every report is 2, 3, 4, really smart, really new, really fresh, really essential pieces of information that no one's ever going to know existed.
So it's hard to believe that there could be smart brevity skeptics. But you, Jim VandeHei, are married to one.
My wife hates smart brevity.
So tell us about it.
She was taunting me the entire time that I was writing the book on my phone. She's a lover of words, like a voracious
She's an
reader.
academic.
Oh, and is a big consumer, but loves words. Has always been in love with words and is in love with literature. And my point isn't like that everything should be smart brevity. I don't think you should take great novels and turn them into like 200-word sound bites. But the thing that we're trying to cure for, in all seriousness, is you're never going to have time to watch The Godfather or read a book or read The Atlantic unless you figure out how to make all those other parts of information consumption in your life exponentially more efficient. It's Mike's point that, like, think about all the stuff you put aside to read later. It's never been read later. It never was. None of us do it because we have less and less time, and we have more and more demands on our mind share. And we always like only half joke when people are like, "Oh, who's your competition? Is it CNN? Is it the New York Times?" Like, no, it's Tinder. And it's any like app that would be dinging that was going to take you away from reading news content. And we all have, most people have, couple dozen apps on their phone. They have websites that they love. They have people that they're texting and snapping with. Like, that's just a lot getting poured at you. So if you don't figure out a way to make that way more efficient, you're never going to get to the good stuff. And I think my dream would be that one day soon we will reach information nirvana, which would be that the information that should be efficient and respectful of your time is, so that the stuff that we're reading that requires depth and requires nuance and requires time, that we actually have time to read it. Because that's the weirdest thing about the last decade. This should be nirvana for information consumption. There's more good information on any topic you could possibly imagine available at your fingertips for free than at any point in humanity, and it's not even close. And yet most people, if you ask them, maybe not about themselves, but their friends, they would say they're not getting smarter faster, they're getting dumber quicker. And we've got to somehow solve for that, because you ultimately do need people paying attention to and acting upon high quality content. Like, if you really want to step back at 30,000 feet and like, why are you guys in journalism? Why are you still starting these media companies? Why do you still work 18 hours a day? It's because facts matter. News matters. High quality information matters. Look at what's happening in society, where we're bifurcated. We're moving into these different bubbles, different universes, where people get different sets of facts or different information based on their ideology or their location, which ultimately obviously leads to this sort of corrosive politics we have, but ultimately could destroy the country. Like, if people aren't making wise decisions based on information that everybody can trust, or at least trust that people were trying to get to the closest approximation of the truth, bad things happen. And so it's not, smart brevity is not going to cure all of society's ills, but the idea is if we can make the information consumption you're doing with us more edifying, I shouldn't use that word, and more useful to you, and we can help companies figure out how to communicate more usefully so that they can grow in a really chaotic environment, I think the world is a better place.
I totally believe that. In fact, I love what you write about how on the road to smart brevity, you had that holy shit, life will never be the same again moment. And I think anybody who reads the book will have that moment, because you see, yes, it can be this way. And you said something, Jim. Okay, I have a few hundred more questions, but I will end with this very important question you gave me before we go to the audience. And you gave me an opening for it, because you talked about working 18 hours a day. So I want to ask, you are producing so much in a smart brevity way, so many newsletters, events, an entire empire you are building. How are you, when you're not so brilliantly communicating, unplugging, recharging, and are able to return to work the best you can possibly be?
Man, you must run a company called Thrive, right? You always make me feel guilty about my lack of work-life balance. I mean, I think, listen, like, I exercise every day religiously. I meditate. I pray. I spend high quality time with my kids, like that is, and my wife. I think those are, like, to me, if I stack those, it's healthy. I'm not the best role model in terms of work-life balance, but only because I think I have approached professional nirvana, which is I spent my entire life trying to get to as close to 100% of the time that I'm working, doing things that I think I'm authentically good at, and I get positive energy from. And I would do it for free. And again, like, I know I'm, like, entitled, like, I'm lucky.
I keep telling him not to say that.
But I
He would like to
love
get
what I
paid
do.
a fair wage for his work.
But I'm lucky that way. So therefore, I would do, like, if I didn't work, like, I don't consider it working when, like, this last weekend I was on the phone all morning gossiping with media reporters, because I love media gossip. I love to know what's going on in other companies. I love to talk about politics. I love to talk to people about how do you run a company. I love talking about communicating. So the things that I get paid money to do, I would do for free, even if, like, Mike fired me or Roy fired me.
I love that. And we don't actually believe in work-life balance. I mean, I think that's an illusion. I think we just believe in taking time to recharge so you don't work in a depleted, exhausted state, and you clearly are not. So you guys are just perfect. Thank you for writing an absolutely amazing book. And if I can talk to your wife, please send her my way. I may try to convince her. So, questions. First of all, I'm asked to remind you that our three authors are going to stay behind to sign copies of the book for you. So get them for yourself, get them for holiday gifts. Couldn't do anything better to help people change their lives, communicate better, be happier. So, how has new technology and ways we consume media changed the way we communicate? This is from a live stream viewer. So the impact on new technologies on how we communicate.
I mean, one of the things we talked about earlier is just our obsession with our phones, right? And just all the messages coming in and the inability, I think, to put them aside during meetings, or even when you're reading something, you get a bing and you're like, okay, you're off and concentrating on something else. So we've got to figure out better ways to be able to focus our time. And I think, like, in the organizations that we help, so we help 400 companies work with Smart Brevity, what we've seen is engagement goes up. Engagement goes up, understanding goes up, like, people are able to see the vision of what the company is trying to do. So I think it can help in that way. But technology is one that's going to just keep, I think, pushing the limits of what attention we have.
So we have many questions from the live stream audience, but if there is anybody here in the room, yes.
Hi, dear.
It's okay, we don't have a mic, but if you...
That's okay. Oh, well, first of all, thank you so much for writing this book that is so needed right now. As an English major who started writing in poetry, people would say to me, it's beautiful, but what does it mean? And that was my nightmare, because the whole point of communicating is if you have a message, you want people to understand what that message is. And I am a proud Thrive contributor and a big fan of Arianna, and I think she has taught me so much. In one sentence, she can communicate warmth and clarity at the same time. And I think one of the parts when I was listening to it on Audible yesterday, I was horrified when you said, don't put hope all is well, because I think one of my brand things is not really being PC in the sense that, you know, I can't talk to Arianna and not say congratulations on being a grandma. That to me is like the point of relationships are my... So I wanted to ask you, how do we do this without being clinical? Because I think it's sort of my nightmare, but it's a really needed thing. And so I would love some clarity from you guys. Thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you. And thank you for the congratulations. The best thing.
I have good news. You can keep congratulating Arianna. So that's authentic to you, and it's thoughtful. Like, hope you're doing well like isn't thoughtful, and it doesn't accomplish anything. What you use the word clinical, which is the approach we take to bringing clarity, like factual understanding of events, to help people see all sides, understand all sides. But that doesn't mean sterile. So Asia Moore, who's our executive editor, who's here, like all of our journalists, we urge them to write like humans, to communicate with like humans. That so much of what's out there either is written by an algorithm or seems like it is, but all smart brevity is going back to what Jim said at the beginning, like talking the way that we would talk if we were having chips and salsa or coffee or even Irish coffee. That speaking like one human to another, giving you something that's worthy of your time, not insulting your intelligence, and doing it in a way that doesn't waste your time and that's respectful of you. Those are all very human qualities that no bot or Tron is going to accomplish.
I love that. Yes, a man. Two men.
Quick, I'll be really quick. What do you think thank you. And perhaps this is in the book, but I haven't gotten there. What would you say the biggest differences are between smart brevity and inverted pyramid, which is how you teach, young journalists how to, the lead, the nut graph, context. I mean, inverted pyramid seems like a proto smart brevity, but I wonder what the difference is in your perspective.
Yeah, I would say inverted pyramid, for those of you who aren't in journalism, is kind of what you're taught in terms of how to write a news story and like the most important stuff and work your way down. I think what's different is all that is like a broad structure. One, it doesn't have a restriction on and sort of encourage you to write shorter. It's just the overall structure. And it doesn't teach you what to do with inside that structure in terms of how to talk about it, how to highlight things that matter, how to use strong words instead of weak words and normal words instead of fancy words. And so like none of this stuff is like revolutionary, right? Everyone is just, I always laugh at everyone's like, oh, you created something. Like no one created anything, right? People created things a long time ago. It's always like a slight evolution to match that moment. That's the way we always think about it when you're starting companies, is like what evolution can we make that helps solve a need in this moment? And that's where sort of smart brevity comes from, and it's an advancement on other thoughts that people have had, but sort of matched for this moment. Where technology, to the question about like what has technology done, like it's the biggest, most profound change in information consumption since the creation of the printing press, right? And probably maybe even more profound. Like it is, because it's also it's hit that distraction part. And I don't even think we've come to grips with it. I think the last couple of elections showed us like the power of information, both information consumption and manipulation. But these are babies, right? We started Politico 15 years ago. That's when the iPhone came online. That's when Facebook really took off. Huntington Post didn't exist. Axios didn't exist. Politico didn't exist. Most sites that you go to didn't exist. These are all brand new technologies that we're only starting to get our heads around. And so you need to, now that we have this new mode of communication, this new mode of information consumption and dissemination, you have to adjust to it. It's not going to go away. 80% of information that's consumed, that's produced by Axios, is done on a mobile phone. That number's not going down. It's going up. I haven't looked at a computer other than twice, I think, in the last 5 years. Everything I consume has been on a phone. And I did it purposely in the beginning because we knew that's where the consumer was going. And I wanted to make sure that that's where we were sort of studying the design and principles that would guide them. But that is the future. And so you need to keep adapting.
So we have a lot of live stream questions. I'm going to combine two, and then we'll end with a question from the audience. So how do we balance speed with fact-checked, accurate reporting? And connected to that, in a way, how influential will media be in the upcoming midterm and national elections?
I'll take the first one. So if you are a media company and you care about your audience, you care about your brand, trust is more important than anything. And we tell our journalists, you'll never be judged on speed alone. You'll never be judged on clicks. Like what's most important to Axios is that we be trusted by our audience. And so there's no shortcut or sacrifice there that's worthwhile. Like something that you teach a new reporter is people will remember if you were wrong a lot longer than they'll remember if you were first.
In terms of media's importance in the election, like obviously we think the media is very important. I do think something you should pay attention to is I think this election and certainly the 2024 presidential election, 24 in particular, is going to be the first one where we are truly going to have two parties that are campaigning and only talking to a parallel universe. If you look at what Ron DeSantis is doing in Florida, he never has talked to a mainstream reporter, very rarely. They won't return phone calls from most mainstream reporters. You talk to a reporter who goes to a rally, not only do Republicans not talk to pollsters, they don't want to talk to reporters anymore. And there's going to be insane amount of pressure on all Republican candidates to not deal with the traditional media sources and to go to Fox News and go to other right-wing sites or other folks who have big presence on social media. And I think the DeSantis formula will be the Republican formula. And I think that's dangerous when people are in these filter bubbles. And one of the things that we try to do is we don't have an opinion page. We ask our reporters not to express their opinions in public because we're trying to do everything we can to win over the persuadables. If we bifurcate permanently, and there's a decent chance we do, that if this country basically moves into one side has their media and their set of facts and the other has their media and their side of facts, bad things will happen. Governance will become more complicated. Manipulation of information will accelerate. And outcomes will worsen. And so my hope is that media rises to the moment. I think media deserves a lot of the blame that it gets sometimes for how it behaved, particularly how reporters behave on Twitter and exposed and revealed their ideology when their job was to be getting to the closest approximation of the truth. Hopefully the media writ large will rise to the moment, return to doing good clinical reporting that people can trust, and let people make their own decisions on that content. It's not your job to cheerlead. It's not your job to get into ideological wars on social media or cable. It's to help people better understand the complexities of a world that is changing faster than most of our minds are capable of keeping up with. It's a tough time as a news consumer. I think it's a tough time to be a citizen just because there's so many things happening that you need to have a relatively high quality input so that you can have a better visibility into what's happening before you.
So do you know what percentage of your readers are Republicans and what Democrats?
We don't have great data on the ideology. I think ours is pretty balanced. Like whenever you do all those different studies that I've seen on the outside, both in the content that we produce and the readership, I think we tend to be one that's very much in the middle. We do tend to, like others, have really heavy consumption in San Francisco, D.C., and New York City. And when you do, you're going to have a much more heavily skewed liberal population in those areas. But for the most part, I feel pretty good that we have a nice balanced audience. And then just looking at the feedback we get on stories, we definitely hear from both sides. And even like the Trump White House, like we were at war, and I think Jonathan Swan and Axios probably did some of the most aggressive, meaningful interviews of him. I don't think they loved us, but I think that they would say, like, we were trying to do reporting. We were trying to get facts out there of what was happening, and hopefully they would say our reporting was as accurate or more accurate than other news outlets. And that's all you can do. That's what we tell our reporters, is just go out and try to get to the closest approximation of the truth. Try to be fearless in figuring out what's actually going on, hold people to account when you can hold them to account, and inform people, give people context. People are dying for high quality content. People want sane coverage, and if you can deliver it, hopefully over time, those people who aren't so partisan that they're persuadable, they'll come your way. They'll trust you, and that's why if you make an error, admit that you made an error. Right? It's a lot of the relationship you have between you and the reader is no different than I would have with you. If I do something wrong, if I wrong you, if I admit it and apologize, we can still have a relationship. But if I'm stubborn and I act like we don't ever get anything wrong, then eventually you're not going to trust me because nobody's infallible.
I love it. Okay, one last question. Smart brevity, please.
Thank you so much for this incredible conversation. The one area that I think could really benefit from smart brevity is the scientific community, and particularly the environmental scientists out there who are trying to communicate climate change in ways that are compelling. And I'm just wondering, have you ever helped scientists to take their data and synthesize it and distill it in such a way that it's more digestible to the public? Small bites, I guess, is what we need. Thank you.
We have a communication software part of the company, and we've had a couple of companies that specialize in scientific research that have utilized it for that very reason. And I would put science in the same category as academics and think tankers, where you're really smart, I swear you are, I just don't know what I'm supposed to be paying attention to and what actually is new and why it matters. And so if you could take good scientific research, good academic research, good think tank research, and tell me what's actually new, tell me why it matters, and if I do go deeper, lay it out in that inverted pyramid so I understand the data points that you have that are new and most illuminating, so I can walk away with whatever amount of time I can allocate to that specific piece of information with as much content as possible. And that goes, it is a good place to end, where that's being respectful of the audience. Like, if you only have 1 minute, I want to make it the best minute of your life in terms of the content I'm delivering. If you have 5, I want to make it the best 5 minutes of your life. And, you know, if you're my mother and you make it the full 10 minutes, God bless you, right? But, like, you probably didn't need to. You got the best stuff up top. And I think if we could all do that, I think we can make our workplace, I think we can make our not-for-profits, I think we can make our classrooms just like more efficient, more useful places.
Well, that was an amazing hour. I want to thank you so much for being here, for writing the book, for changing the way we communicate. I've been thinking of one syllable word to sum it up, but I'm afraid I have failed. So let me just say illuminating, inspiring, entertaining, and fun.
IMF OMG.